I have a bit of a presentation I'll share with you, and then we can jump into an instance, and really hoping to get you guys to understand in general software assets. Just want to talk about a little bit about the different SAM editions. There's actually 3 different software asset management within ServiceNow. Only one of them is true software asset management, and that's SAMPAI or SAMP Professional. There's a basic software asset management that's included with the baseline ITSM, and really all it is it allows you to track your purchases. You can input a software license. It doesn't give you any capabilities of comparing what you have installed versus what you purchased. It doesn't reconcile, it doesn't count, it doesn't do any of those things. So I think it really should just be called a software license tracker. It's just somewhere for you to record that you've made a purchase and that you have a license. And to be honest, I think that's better than nothing. A lot of customers, most of our customers, I would say, are working in spreadsheets that are distributed across the organization. And so actually getting the counts of who owns what is really difficult. So if they can even just put it in ServiceNow to begin with, that's at least something. But it's not software asset management. And to be honest, neither is software asset management foundation. And so it's no longer recommended, and it may no longer be offered even. I don't remember if they've completely taken it off the table, but it takes more work to migrate a customer from foundation to professional than it's worth to get them started on foundation. So we don't really talk about it unless the customer already has it and we have to do work to get them off of it. We just kind of ignore that that exists. We don't recommend it. We don't sell it. It was a completely manual process, so you could compare what you'd purchased versus what you have, but you actually had to go in and define everything by hand. You had to go create every single software model by hand and create the mapping to the installations by hand. When we migrate people to professional, there's actually a script that we have to run that removes all of the customizations that the customer did on software asset management, because most customers were changing their forms, they were adding fields, they were doing things in foundations to try to make it work. So in professional, we have to remove all those customizations. It's really the only full feature option, and it's really the only thing that we should recommend or suggest when it comes to software asset. Of course, if a customer is not looking in this direction, we still recommend that they record it in ServiceNow in the CMDB, kind of that basic, but we should really be pushing software asset professional. It has the data feeds that come from ServiceNow Content Service. So instead of users having to map all of their software manually, ServiceNow has all of those maps, or at least a large portion of those maps. The last time I looked, there was almost 300,000 different software definitions, and there is a feedback loop. So ServiceNow, if you opt in, will automatically upload your software definitions, and then they'll be included in future releases. So that's a pretty cool feature that they offer to keep that software definition database up to date. And then the licensing for SAM Professional, the last I looked, is a per computer licensing. A little bit different than how Discovery used to be licensed. Discovery was a per node because there's different types of objects that you could hit. But with SAMP, it's licensed per computer, so per end device that software could be installed on, which is really only going to be computers. There aren't other types of devices that can have software. The prerequisites for SAMP are actually pretty long, and it's gotten better with New York. So the entire right column, all of those software asset management professional 4, those are called the publisher packs. And you used to have to request them individually, and you had to put in a high ticket for them because they didn't even have them in the catalog. With New York and later, they're included in software asset management professional. So if you request just the baseline package to be installed, all of the publisher packs get installed as well. In addition to that, what we typically deploy and what is really required is procurement. So they have to install the procurement plugin if they want any of the procurement type functions with requesting software. Cost management is required because we do automatically insert costs and line items for the software that gets purchased. We want them to have data certification. It's required for the software asset as well as the normalization data services. Both of those are really important for keeping the data clean, which is extremely important. This is all CMDB. really, really important, and this one gets misunderstood all the time, and that is discovery. Discovery really is a prerequisite, for all intents and purposes. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, but in general, discovery must be the current version with patterns. So if a customer is an older customer and they've been using discovery for a while, they likely have the probes and sensors, and that is not compatible with SAM Professional. They need to be migrated to patterns first before we can deploy ServiceNow SAM Professional, or at least during the project, we should do those things together. And that gets missed a lot. It's really confusing with the discovery changes and what pieces are actually required. So that's why I say, in general, discovery is required, and if the customer can't and doesn't want to go down that path, we can talk about alternates, but it's going to affect how much of their enterprise we can actually measure. The last one that's going to be required is the SAM Premium usage integration, but that's only if they want to track usage. Usage is really helpful. It uses metering information from SCCM. For anybody who's not familiar with SCCM, every Windows machine has Microsoft System Center installed on it. System Center, when you have a professional version of Windows, collects all of your software information, all of your hardware information, and it centralizes that into a database, what we call SCCM, System Center Configuration Manager. And that configuration manager allows you to push out applications, to uninstall applications, to meter who is using what, who is who's assigned to what computer, who's logging into what computer. All of that type of Windows layer information gets collected by SCCM. So we integrate with the SCCM database, and that's how we get our software installation information. I'll talk about that in a minute. But there's also an additional integration that we can set up that allows us to get the usage information. So if users aren't using the software on their computer, or they're not using it frequently enough, we can tell the system to automatically uninstall that software based on the usage. That's what that plugin is for. Just a few quick tables and terms. I'm not going into details on these, but just want to make you familiar with the technology or the terminology that we use in ServiceNow. So a publisher, product, and model are probably the three most common terms that you're going to hear. Typically, it's software publisher, software product, and software model, just for clarification, because there are other types of products and models. Our example here is Microsoft is the publisher, Word is the product, and then the model would be a more specific version of Word. So it's going to be Word Professional 2010. So that includes a version, edition, and any other type of criteria that we define for measuring that particular model. So I'm only going to have one Word product, but I'm going to have several different Word models, because I'll have 2010 and 2016, and there might be professional and standard, and those are all going to be different software models because I'm going to measure them separately. One thing of note, a publisher is the same as a manufacturer in this usage, but that is not the same as a vendor. You can have both a publisher and a vendor that are different on a software license or a software title. The next term you'll hear a lot is an entitlement. So this is essentially the license or how many rights we own. So in the case of our software model, we would say that we have 200 of Word Professional 2010. We have 200 licenses to use Word Professional 2010. That is our entitlement. We also have records that are software subscriptions, typically comes from the cloud integrations for Microsoft and Adobe. We have software installations, which are from SCCM and Discovery. We have software usage we talked about from SCCM. We have two confusing terms. One is discovery model and one is discovery map. These easily get mixed up. I still mix them up all the time. The discovery model helps us normalize the discovered values. So what we get from SCCM and Discovery, we normalize those into our publishers, products, and models. The discovery map is what then takes those installation records that we've discovered and maps them to the appropriate software model. Really confusing. You really don't have to get into that a whole lot, but just know that we do work with Discovery and how we map those software installations for usage. There's also the concept of a reclamation candidate, which is software that can be uninstalled from a computer. The 3 out-of-box reasons for that are blacklisted, meaning the model has been marked as blacklisted and does not belong in the environment. And typically we can set up rules to have those automatically removed if the customer desires. There's an asterisk on that one that I'll talk about in a little bit. At least there should be an asterisk. There's also unlicensed. So if you have software that you don't have enough licenses for, we can remove the unused ones or the unlicensed ones. And then we also have the low usage reclamation. So that's based on the metering data. And what happens is the system generates these reclamation candidate records. And then we go through the process of determining whether those should be applied or not. And then it calls out to the integration with SCCM to trigger the uninstallation of software for both unlicensed and low usage. For the blacklisted software, I have another slide on this, but if the customer wants to have the ability to remove blacklisted software, it requires them to have discovery orchestration. Blacklisted software, by definition, doesn't have a package for them to be able to manage it. They can't push it and uninstall it because they haven't defined it in their environment. But we can use orchestration to trigger an uninstall using a command line. And as you can imagine, a lot of security teams don't like that option, the ability to run a command line against any computer in their environment. So there's a lot of challenges with uninstalling blacklisted software and using orchestration for that purpose. So we typically focus on unlicensed and low usage. And then the last pieces are the reconciliation, which is our comparison of what we've purchased versus what we have deployed in our environment. So that's all contained, it all rolls up into what's called a reconciliation result. And that might be a singular publisher, or it might be a whole group of publishers. It could be a specific location in the company or a department. You can run reconciliation in various different groupings. Within that reconciliation, you'll have the product, which is that higher level. The product is going to either be compliant or not compliant based on what's underneath it, which is the model results. So again, we might have 4, 5, 6 different models that roll up to a product, and each of those models can also be compliant or not compliant. And then underneath that, for each model result, there is a metric result, which is how we measure the software that is installed. And those are going to give us numbers. Those are going to tell us what is actually deployed versus what is owned and actually distributed out. Another quick slide, I'll actually go quickly through this one, just to give you an idea of how many things SAM touches. We have several that feed into SAM, and then a whole bunch of things that SAM feeds into. One thing I want to call attention to that's coming is the vulnerability response for SecOps. So when you're doing your patching and you're trying to identify holes in your infrastructure, this information from SAM will be really important and will allow you to patch at-risk systems when you identify those. So that's something I think that's really cool. I don't think that's New York. I think that's Orlando that's coming. But anybody interested in SecOps would be cool to get together. A few notes on deploying SAM. Again, the discovery is required. If you don't have discovery, there are at least 4 major products that you won't be able to measure: Microsoft SQL, Oracle Database, Citrix Zen Desktop, and VMware vCenter, which are typically the products that most customers want to measure. The reasoning behind that is that discovery actually has scripts that run in those servers, and they have to collect all of the deployment information. So instead of just what software is installed, it has to know, is it virtualized? How many databases have been created? Who has access to those databases? Those models are much more complicated, and so discovery has to log into those systems and get the details. In the case of VMware vCenter, it actually logs into vCenter, the application, and gets all of the license key and usage information from vCenter and uses that. So discovery is required for those big products and for the other large products. SCCM or equivalent is required. If they don't have some sort of a data feed for their hardware and software information, we can't do anything in software asset. We have to have SCCM or equivalent. SAM Pro is kind of an all or nothing. It's really either on or off. So a lot of people ask us to do a phase 1 or a small implementation. And the truth is, with SAM Pro, we have to deploy the whole thing at once. Now, we may not focus on truing up our numbers all at once. We are going to pick 1 or 2 products, But when we're actually doing the deployment, we can't really do partial deployments. It's kind of an all or nothing sort of a thing. So keep that in mind. SAM Pro does not require SAM Foundations. We do not want that as an upgrade path. I'd prefer if we don't have SAM Foundation customers. Hardware asset management is absolutely essential. We have deployed where people don't have a good HAM process, and part of the deployment is we require them to set up a good HAM process. Because if their hardware assets aren't correct and they're not being retired and they're not being removed and they're not being updated, then all of our software data is going to be incorrect. So they have to have a good hardware asset process of making sure their data is correct and going through the retirement, or we really can't do anything. I don't know if other modules are quite the same, but at least software asset comes with the recommended policies. It is such a big change that a lot of organizations have trouble adapting. And so ServiceNow has about a dozen policies that they have provided that they suggest you implement in your environment to support SAMP. Recommend that you always deploy baseline for phase one. We have made the mistake, even here at GlideFast, of deploying baseline plus and giving the customer the additional functionality that they ask for, and it has not gone very well for us. The ServiceNow recommended path is that we always deploy baseline for phase one, and that we start with just 2 or 3 publishers. And anything beyond that, we're setting ourselves up for failure. David and I can both vouch for that. One of the challenges is that the publisher scripts are often black box. So when we try to build functionality on top of SAM Pro, a lot of the scripts and how things function, we just don't have access to. We can't read the code behind it because the scripts are read protected. So it's a real challenge to be able to build stuff on top. The catalog is optional but highly recommended. Most people want a software catalog, and I recommend a few items for that. Typically we do a handful, 2 or 3 items to show them how it works and then allow them to build their own. Certainly don't have to have that for phase one, but it's pretty typical. As mentioned, start with 2 or 3 big publishers, and then we try to prove the value of the system and get the customer comfortable in the system so that they're starting to take over and run it from there. Really, once we have it set up, it becomes more of a data cleanup and maintenance type effort for us. There's not a lot of development and effort that has to go in once we get it up and running. Most of it is getting the customer adapted to using the system. I recommend, and ServiceNow recommends, that you start with the big 5, and this list is actually expanding now, but I still prefer to start with the big 5 instead of 8 or 9 or whatever it is now. These are the ones that most customers want: Microsoft, Adobe, Citrix, Oracle, and VMware. There's lots of hand-holding and lots of training clients when it comes to SAMP. It's not as heavy technical, I would say, as a lot of deployments. It's a lot of data, it's a lot of planning, and a lot of mapping in order to be successful. And then a typical phase one, 3 to 6 months deployment. Usually that's a pilot or a proof of value. It has a limited selection of products that we're going to try to true up. We do baseline request and procurement workflows. Don't customize those right out the gate because you can get down a rabbit hole really quick. And then governance process and planning are probably the most important pieces that we do in phase one, laying the groundwork for what's going to come before long. I'm going to breeze through the next couple slides. I just wanted to show you how complicated this is. ServiceNow, you're familiar with the phases, the deployment phases: initiate, prepare, create, transition. That's where we typically end, and you'll notice that that's where the maturity level model starts picking up for the customer. I'll also have you notice there's this huge gap here at the beginning, this initiate, prepare, and even during the create phase, where we're really going through all of this planning, this enablement, governance. Everything really needs to happen before we can really start to do anything. So really slow up front, really start to mature as we get into the transitioning phase and the customer starts to take over, and then they start to run with it from there. A couple notes on data sources discovery. This is a customer-facing slide that I just copied. Important note here is that it is for mostly servers, storage, network devices, SQL databases, VMware. Anything that's in the data center is typically going to be discovery. SCCM is best for desktops and laptops, your end user computing. Even though SCCM does cover Windows servers in most environments, we still recommend that you use Discovery for those, just because of the power of Discovery and all those things that it can do. Orchestration isn't required for software asset, but it does allow you to do things like Active Directory. A lot of people control their software installations by using Active Directory, so we can perform an integration with that instead of actually controlling SCCM. And Windows, WMI, and SSH. All right, a couple questions. Gary poses a question: if a client has a discovery tool or application deployed such as ADDM, do they still need ServiceNow Discovery, or can ADDM integrate or populate ServiceNow CMDB? And David's response is, I'm not sure what that integration would look like because I know nothing about ADDM, but I'm sure they can use that in lieu of ServiceNow Discovery if that's what they choose to use. Absolutely true. You can use other discovery sources for the vast majority of the products. When you get back to that list of 4 products for sure, the SQL database, Zen Desktop, and vCenter, I can't answer that question for sure because ServiceNow won't tell us exactly what information they're gathering during the discovery process to make the license calculations work. So they will only say that you have to use Discovery for those products, those 4 products. Everything else, as long as it's populating the CMDB and the software installs, don't really care what the data source is. Good question. Software license metrics, just be familiar that there are software license metrics, and they just mean how we measure the software being installed. Are we measuring it on a per core basis, a device, a user, a processor? There's a bunch of different ways that you can measure whether software is installed or you have the rights for it. Adobe, Citrix, IBM, Microsoft, Oracle, all those big cloud product publishers, the big publishers, they have their own publisher packs and they provide their own metrics behind them. And those are typically what are black box. So Microsoft will provide us, what a per, what's a good use of, what's theirs, like a per core virtual core sort of a thing. And they have specific metrics, or Oracle's another one. They love to have their own metrics. So just know that that's the measurement of software, how we measure it. Custom license metrics, you can create your own. So if you have products like we have a customer that had Veritas software and there wasn't a good matching metrics that they could use. So we created them custom metrics to be able to license their Veritas software. So that was pretty cool. We do also have connections to the cloud. So with the cloud, the primary ones that we see are Adobe and Microsoft Office 365. They released some new ones recently. But when customers want to measure their Adobe Creative Cloud, which is like Photoshop, Illustrator, Animate, all of those things we get through a cloud connection, as well as their Office 365 information. And this is what generates the subscription records. So if we're downloading it from a portal, we treat those records as subscriptions and not as necessarily desktop installs. And then we match those up together and determine what the actual deployment is. So kind of complicated to get in on this discussion, but just know that the Adobe and Microsoft integrations, the things that come from the cloud, are subscriptions, which are slightly different than your regular desktop software installs. In terms of roles, there are some roles, and we really ask customers to define these up front when they are doing their software asset management. We really have to have somebody in all of these roles to be successful. Obviously, a process owner. We need a software asset manager who relates to the SAM team, the owners, and the delivery teams to carry the messages. This is really different than the rest of ServiceNow, I think, in that we also have a SAM admin. And the SAM admin role, there actually is a SAM developer role that gives them more rights than your typical user or manager in the system. And that's because of those discovery maps and discovery models where we're taking discovery data and trying to match it to our software installations. That's a more advanced feature, and you're touching some back-end tables. So they've created a role for that called the SAM admin, and they're kind of the technical person that sits on the software asset team and helps the software asset manager making sure that all of the data remains correct and that everything coming into the system is scrubbed and working well. So I think that's a difference than most of our processes in ServiceNow, in that they have their own kind of quasi-admin that sits on the team. They also have typically a service catalog manager or a relationship with one to help with deploying catalog items. a procurement manager to help with the procurement process, and a contract manager because contracts are very heavily associated with software asset management. So much so, in fact, that in the recent releases of software asset management, instead of just having contract as a separate table that then gets a relationship to a software asset, they've built a lot of the functionality around contracts into the software asset record so that you can keep track of your contractual dates and how long the license is covered under maintenance contracts. All those types of things are now getting built into the entitlements. Knowing what you know about software asset and about asset versus configuration management being the logical relationship between things, and asset being the physical, financial, contractual components. This is my favorite slide because the question is software then an asset or a configuration item? Because it technically covers both of these realms. And now it may not be a physical asset, but it does have a financial and a contractual component to it, but it also has logical relationships and it has operational usage. So the answer to this question is really that software is a bad term. Nobody knows what software actually means because there are so many different pieces of software. We could be meaning different things. Even software license is a very ambiguous term, and we don't use them in ServiceNow very often because they're ambiguous and not very clear. So we use software entitlement. A software entitlement is a physical or digital right to use a software title. So that's typically what we've purchased from a vendor. That's the right to use it. Sometimes it's digital, sometimes it's not. So software entitlement is what we own. The software allocation then is when we turn around and take what we purchased and divide it out internally. So if I purchase 100 of a product, and then I say Bob gets to use one, Joe gets to use one, Jim gets to use another, Susan gets to use another, that's an allocation because I'm taking what I've purchased and dividing it internally. A license key is not the same as a software entitlement or a software license because the license key is just a code that verifies that we have the right to use the software. It is not the actual right in and of itself. An interesting side note with the certifications that I have from Software Asset is that just owning the software, or excuse me, just having the software and just having a software license is not actually enough to legally own software. To legally own software, you have to have the software installation, the software license, you have to have a record of the purchase from the vendor, and that should be it, those three things. So you have to have who sold it to you even for it to be a valid software right. Moving down, software installation. This is where we get the dual asset and configuration item. The asset is the entitlement that we purchased. The configuration item is the software installation record in ServiceNow that tells us what's installed on that computer. It's just a representation of the software being configured on that device. A software model is the common configuration across all of the multiple installations. So I won't go into details about models. I think you're all familiar with what a model is. And then software catalog item is the orderable item in the service catalog. And a software contract is a contract record that has the type of software contract. So lots of terms around software. It's important that when you're talking about software asset management, that you're clear on the terms that you're using because it can be really confusing for the customer, even more so than us. And that's why I adopt the ServiceNow terminology, software entitlement, software allocation, license key, because then our terminology is clear and consistent.